presentation on this very important book that I hope you've had a chance to. I've read it already, it's good. You should read it more than once, simply because if you have normal cognition, you generally retain 80% if you read things twice. It's a study of media, what happened in the last 40 years, and how as a nation we've come from a nation of citizens to a nation of consumers. A nation where consensus reality can replace truth. If enough people believe it, it must be true. So he and his partner kind of go through that and look at how it's changed America and built a framework for reality TV presidents. Most importantly, it offers solutions that are actionable. Now, if there's anyone here who doesn't know, Mickey here, along with his partner Nolan Higdon, wrote the book. Mickey is a professor of history at Diablo Valley College and the host on the Project Censored radio show, which is on a bunch of stations. Here it's on KPFA Fridays at 1 still. And one of the forces behind this isn't out yet, friends, 2020 Project Censored. The thing about the Project Censored books is if you read them, you'll have an idea of what's going on the rest of the year and the first half of next year that you won't get from the corporate media. Now, his partner, Nolan Higdon, is a professor of history at East Bay College at Cal State, let me get this right, Cal State and University of San Francisco, on the board of directors of the Media Freedom Foundation, and on the Global Critical Media Project. And that's what this is about. Global critical media. That means to use critical thinking skills when looking at media so that you can take apart that which is real and that which is, polite circles, gobbledygook. Okay? So I'm going to bring on Mickey right now, and judging by everybody, we're going to put up with the buzz on the sound if we can, because I want to turn on the fan. We got people dropping on us. Does anyone object to me flipping the fan on?
Oh, no.
Okay. Hey, I'm going to send this around so that at least 3 of you can help the center. And these guys are going to be right at the door on the way out so that you can join if that's what you want to do. Here, I'm going to start with you. Mickey, it's all yours. Oh, if you can pass it on then.
How long would you like me to talk before opening things up?
Well, how long do you want to have for questions?
Oh, we're at least at an hour.
Okay, you can sit about an hour and 15.
I can talk less. I don't know.
We generally try to get out at 9.
Yeah, no worries. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Megan. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for asking. I hope you're all well on this balmy Monday evening, first day of autumn-ish, or first day or second day? Somewhere. Yeah, there you go. Right. And we are all triggered by smelling things in the air, right? So Rebel, thanks so much for that kind introduction. Nolan Higdon is actually a former student of mine. So one of the great privileges of being a professor and not just being someone that's at a research university. I teach community college. I teach social science and history at Diablo Valley College. I mean, I've taught it a dozen other places. I also concurrently teach communications at Cal State East Bay, and on occasion, when Peter Phillips is out or on sabbatical, I teach his stuff at Sonoma State University, and likely people here know Peter, and I have Peter's giant book over there. I have United States of Distraction, which just came out in August at City Lights, so it's a great honor to be at Lawrence Ferlinghetti's house. He just turned 100 in March. And he's still working on things, and he's still up and about. I was just there last Thursday giving a talk with Nolan, so that was great to see everybody at City Lights. And of course, as ever, Censored 2020 is out next month, and I have debut copies for sale for you all this evening, so you can be the first cool kids on your block to have those. If you're interested, I've of course donated copies as well to the library here. And we're always working with people how we can to get the information out. The ProjectCensored.org website has a lot of free materials over the years, including our top stories back to 1976 when Carl Jensen started the project. Peter took over in 1997-ish, and then I started working with Peter in the mid-2000s with Andy Lee Roth, and became director in 2010. Peter Phillips stuck around with the foundation, Media Freedom Foundation, until 2016. I've been president for the last 3 years, and I've been directing the project since 2010. And this year, the 2020 book is my 8th book with Andy Lee Roth and 70 Stories Press. I've done 11 censored books now. Time flies.
It does.
As you all know, behind me, it's an honor to be both in front of all of this literature and in front of a lot of really caring and compassionate people that want to come out on a Monday night and hear about something like this. We could all be home distracting ourselves with various things, but really the point here, obviously, is to, well, look, the people in this room are not the ones that are likely distracted, right? You know where this place is. You know what happens here. You do social justice work as a regular course of who you are as people. And it's an honor to be invited. I'm kind of part of the community. I live in Sonoma County in Petaluma. I don't get up to Santa Rosa all the time, but I know quite a number of you from over the years from a lot of places. And some of you may even hear my screechy voice on Fridays at KPFA. So we're still doing that. Almost 10 years we've survived that place, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people that haven't lasted there that long. But Pacifica, warts and all, is one of the key places for information we have. And so Peter Phillips and I really work to try to just navigate that place and bury hatchets and just do what we can and not get involved in the personal political squabbles that take place there, because we have an awful lot of work to do. And the work is important, and that's what we try to focus on. And I, again, am privileged to teach. I've taught college almost 20 years now. And Nolan, who I co-authored this book with, was a student of mine once upon a time, about 16 or 17 years ago, when he drifted in from a working class community into one of my classes at DVC. And then he has gone on and come back and forth, and the next thing you know, I was not only able to work with him as a TA, I was able to bring him on as an adjunct faculty member and work with him on other publications. He's a longtime contributor to the project as well. And so that's a poignant reminder of, you never know who you're running across and what they're going to get out of it and what they're going to come back with later. And so yeah, I said, well, you asked for it. So he stuck around. And of course I asked for it with Peter. I bird dogged Peter for a long time when I moved out to California from the Rust Belt, and harassed him into letting me work with him. And he was fortunate enough to help me and mentor me professionally, and then ultimately be a big part of Project Censored, which is a really important media literacy organization that I'm proud to be part of. With our hundreds of students every semester, score of faculty, and about 15 to 20 different campuses. So I know local people still affiliate us with Sonoma State, but we've officially been working at Sonoma State, but off campus as a nonprofit for the better part of 9 years. Which has been good for us, and it's, I think, been good for a lot of other people. So this evening, I'd be remiss if I did not say, Project Censored is also a part of the National Coalition Against Censorship, and we are also part of the Banned Books Week Coalition. This week is Banned Books Week. Last week of September, and I've got some Banned Books Week handbooks and bookmarks and things here. The last Project Censored show, in fact, that's archived online, was a special on Banned Books Week with the American Library Association, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. He works on academic freedom, Kids' Right to Read Project. So we're really honored to do all the things we do for freedom of information, the right to read, and First Amendment issues. And obviously, we've not pleased everyone over the last 43 years, and in my last decade plus involved. We've run into some interesting conflicts with people who purport to be in favor of a free press and free speech, but rather litmus test on their primary interests of concern. And if you run afoul of that litmus test, where you may agree with 90% of what someone does, if you disagree with that one little sliver, they not only kick you to the curb, but they try to pound you into the ground and into oblivion. there's really no place for that kind of behavior in left-wing progressive politics. And I've abhorred it my whole life, and I refuse to participate in it, which is partially how we're probably still in KPFA. People can pound away at me. If they don't have facts and evidence, they brush off very easily. I'm older these days, so I'm not in this for ego, and I'm not in this to be right. I'm just in this because it's something that I do, it's something I'm passionate about, I happen to know something about it, and I just want to share the things that I know and that we do, and work with networks of people to continue the work, because I'm 48 now, and Nolan's in his 30s, and you try to get younger people involved, and part of getting younger people involved is sometimes shutting up and listening to them. And that's not always easy, and that doesn't always yield the best results that we all want. But if we don't really try to reach out and pay attention and listen to younger people as part of the educational process, I think we fail to learn important lessons ourselves as we grow older. And I've been really lucky to work with people like Noam Chomsky. This is the second forward Ralph Nader has written for a book that I've done, and Ralph's 85. I was just on his show a couple weeks ago. He still does amazing work. And again, there's somebody on some corner of the left that's going to get into a vicious fight about why Ralph does X, Y, and Z, and they just think that they're just going to flush 50 some odd years of his career down the drain and think that the one or two things they don't like somehow washes that away. And I think that that's the kind of political personality work or identity politic work on the left that I think is really going to backfire in a lot of ways. And so I try to not get involved in those conflicts, and when they arise, I try to listen. That said, I was going to start the evening, because this is a City Lights book, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti was such an incredible contributor to that culture, from the beat culture, the publishing house, so many of the books that the feds were trying to come and get and literally burn, and he hid them away, so many risks that he took over the years. Some of the people that he's worked with, some of the people that we likely never would have heard of if he didn't have them signed on. And again, he's still very active. And some of you, of course, may likely remember this, given the anniversary. I'm sorry, that's probably the wrong word. The commemoration. Anniversaries are things that we often celebrate as milestones, and I don't think 9/11 is one of those. So it's something that we remember, and remember U.S. Instigative role globally in causing a lot of problems, and I'm not going to run into the whole issues with 9/11 here right now. But Lawrence Ferlinghetti wrote a really wonderful, sad, but I think really poignant and wonderful poem 12 years ago. Some of you may know it. Does anybody recall "Pity the Nation"? Yeah, you do. So you'll remember this. He says, "Pity the nation whose people are sheep and whose shepherds mislead them. Pity the nation whose leaders are liars, whose sages are silenced, and whose bigots haunt the airwaves. Pity the nation that raises not its voice except to praise conquerors and acclaim the bully as hero, and aims to rule the world with force and by torture. Pity the nation that knows no other language but its own and no other culture but its own. Pity the nation whose breath is money and sleeps the sleep of the too well fed. Pity the nation, oh pity the people who allow their rights to erode and their freedoms to be washed away. My country, tears of thee, sweet land of liberty." And Lawrence is, poetry can be very, very sad because it's very honest. And I think that this country has a lot of room to grow by looking itself in the mirror and being honest. And there are many people in the United States, that's a misnomer if ever there was, dating back to the 1770s and 80s. But there's a lot of people that have done a lot of good things in this country and that have called out things the way that Ferlinghetti has. And I know a lot of you celebrate those people. And we should remember them because they're really important. One of the retorts often that people have, particularly to those who are critical of U.S. policy, U.S. government, U.S. culture, is, if it's so bad here, why don't you leave? Yeah, and go where? So it's really preposterous that we live in a society that can even tolerate that kind of nonsense. Believe me, I ponder where I could be and where I could go and what I could do, and here I am. I already migrated 33,000 miles out of the Rust Belt as far towards the left coast as I could go. to find my family, my wife, my kids, and the life that I've been fortunate to have. So part of this book, part of the project, is really just part of trying to give back to that culture and that country, because it's not a lost cause. And I feel that there's a lot of desperation among progressives and people on the left, the anybody but Trump crowd, that we're left with very few meaningful choices as to what those alternatives might look like. But we didn't write a book about Trump, and we didn't even write a book about those less than excitable choices. What we wrote about is how we got here. How did this happen? How did we partially let it happen? How did some of it happen as we were somnambulistically drifting in our own lives, trying to make the best of things? But one thing is for sure, we started this out with another epigraph from, of course, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who once wrote, "Our government is a bird with two right wings. They're devoted to the perpetuation and spread of corporate capitalism." And we couldn't think of anybody more apt and with more credibility on the topic to write the foreword than Ralph Nader, who's been living on the front lines of that struggle for over 50 years. And Ralph really poignantly pointed out a lot of things in the foreword to the book that Nolan and I and our wonderful editor, Greg Ruggiero, who we got to work with, we were working through the whole book, and we had a short list of people that we were thinking about writing the foreword, and I just kept going back to Ralph, and I know Ralph, and I've done work with Ralph, and Ralph is a tough cookie. Ralph is like, well, what's in it for me if I write the foreword to this book? And I'm like, well, you'll have your name on the cover of a book that brings forward your thinking to another generation of readers that, I'm sad to say, Ralph, a lot of the young people that I work with don't remember you or know who you are because they weren't taught about you in the first place, right? Right. And it's not really part of the curriculum. Ralph doesn't get to take up a lot of the history books other than being an alleged spoiler in the 2000 election, which again is another false narrative. But he agreed to do this, and if you read nothing else, read Ralph's foreword. It takes about 15 minutes. He says quite succinctly what Ferlinghetti's epigraph sets up, and then he punts it off to us and says, go at it, show them how this is going on in a couple hundred pages. And the agreement between City Lights and our editor and Ralph was, I want more than a paragraph at the end of the book that gives people ideas for what to do. And I said, I couldn't agree more. I've read far too many books that helped me understand the problems, that left me at the end feeling as though that the author was so tired at the end of it all that all they could do was offer up a Hail Mary or a by the way, we can lick this and we can get at it. And I'm like, fine, great, thanks. But when I was younger, I was saying, what does that look like? If I live in a place like Youngstown or Newcastle or somewhere that's been economically destroyed by capitalist powers, and there's very little infrastructure left, and there's people that are very desperate and grasping at straws, and they're voting for Ronald Reagan, for union people, I'm like, this isn't right. There's something wrong with this picture. And so I was eager to try to find out. So that's how I ended up out here, I guess. But I was encouraged from a young age to think for myself and to never accept any gross injustice. And my parents weren't college educated. They were working class people. My dad died of asbestos cancer from working in the mills. So he was a victim of those kinds of for-profit policies, and I saw that. So part of putting together this kind of a project, like the radio show, is it's meant to be read or listened to by everybody, right? We tend to get involved in academia, and we tend to be, writing for each other about how smart we are, and some of us forget that that's all well and good, but that's not why we're here. And that's not why those institutions are here either. They're supposed to lift other people up. I was among an early generation of people who go to college in my family. And while most of the things that I teach and write about, I did not learn in college, as many of you might attest. It helped me get there. It helped me get to where I needed to be so I could meet somebody like Nolan or the thousands of other people that I've had the privilege of meeting over the years. And so that I've actually then been fortunate enough to try to be able to take these messages to more people, to other places. And that's really what this book is about. It's obviously what almost every one of these books is about, right? It's about celebrating independent journalism and the importance of a free press, while teaching people critical media literacy, teaching them how to be the media, and highlighting key issues going on around us, and decoding propaganda, right? And we all can use a little bit of that. This book, like I said, starts out with a great quote by Lao Tzu. And basically the prologue is, how did we get here? Right? Remember after the 2016 election, there was like some mass hangover. You know, like the 2016 election was some kind of frat-style kegger, you know, with pundits and talking heads just sensationally going on and on about sheer rubbish for weeks on end, blowing every opportunity to tell us what we needed to know. And then the day after, they basically say, we totally blew it. You know, the Washington Post, you know, was so tripping over itself, mea culpaing, that they changed the logo on their masthead to "Democracy Dies in Darkness," right? And I'm like, yes, and Jeff Bezos is turning out the light, right? You know, and this is all part of a scam to boost subscription ratings and get people paying attention to what they want us to think is most important. And you know what the first 2 years of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the MSDNC, as I call it, or MSNBC, right? You know what they focused on at CNN? Russia! As if Russia was the most significant. It was like a 1950 redux. You know, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was like, well, when are they going to reboot Red Dawn? And I was like, oh, wait, they already did. Like, somebody already made a remake of that idiotic propaganda film. But the Lao Tzu quote spoke volumes to me because once wrote, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you're heading. We didn't end up here on November 9th, 2016. We ended up here going all the way back. We can go back a ways. Some of you might go back to the Constitutional Convention and the founders and the bogus compromises. Some of us may go back to the closing of the frontier and Frederick Jackson Turner. Some of us may go back to the progressive era and sort of the reckonings of Charles Beard. Some of us may go back to the Depression or the Fed. I certainly go back to Eddie Bernays and the propaganda campaigns of the early 20th century that set the blueprint to create this phenomenon called the United States of Distraction. Neil Postman in the 1980s for NYU wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. It's probably one of the most prescient books written in the late 20th century. Mark Crispin Miller basically took his seat at NYU as a media ecologist and has been one of the most poignant media critics in the late 20th and early 20th century. There would arguably be no Chris Hedges if there were no Neil Postman, right? There are so many people that have kind of coattailed off of these various characters that I wanted to spend a little bit of time going back to how we got here, because it predates all of us. And so we go back in the book. And well, we start in the present, right? We have our DeLorean and our time machine, and we go back to the future. We go back and forth. But we start it with this. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. Exclaimed Les Moonves while he was executive chairman and CEO of CBS during a Morgan Stanley Technology, Media, and Telecom conference the summer of 2016 in San Francisco. He further stated, I've never seen anything like this. This is going to be a very good year for us. That's a small U.S., not a capital U period S period. Meaning, we're raking it in, and the consequences, we're predicting will be disastrous. But we don't care.
Exactly.
So that is the media culture of the 21st century in the United States of America. It's a corporate media landscape where 5 to 6 companies control 90%. And they know it, and they constantly try to just get their market share for what they need to justify returns to their investors. Over at Fox, that means they need a few million people to tune in to their bloviating xenophobia on a nightly basis. And you know what? They do. And you can't out-Fox Fox. But Rachel Maddow tries with her tedious Russiagate narratives day in and day out, when she could be covering any 10 other issues matter-of-factly going on in our communities, and chooses not to because there's a core of Democratic Party denialists that are rooting for Joe Biden right now that need to hear Russia, Russia, Russia.
Oh, man.
As they're constantly pounding another story about Joe Biden and Ukraine. Notice that they're not talking about Victoria Nuland and the $5 billion the U.S. sunk into Ukraine back in 2013 and 14 under the Obama years when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, where we worked with neo-Nazis to overthrow a democratically elected, albeit corrupt, president, to install a far right-wing government so we could then begin pushing our interests in to keep Russia out of Ukraine, even though they had a long-standing Cold War treaty to remain in Crimea. They did not annex it, and they did not invade it. That is completely false. It is part of the propaganda narrative of the corporate press to keep people scared about Russian oligarchs, but not our own, who not only control our political culture and our media, but they live at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes.
So this is how we start this strange trip into this book. And we go back and we look and we say, well, look, where did we go wrong? Where did things go awry? And I like to go back to World War I, at least because that's where our friend, nephew of Sigmund Freud, Eddie Bernays, was tapped by the Committee on Public Information, which was the first official government propaganda agency created by President Woodrow Wilson, who ran in 1916 as a candidate who kept us out of war. He ran as a peace candidate. All the while, he was nodding and winking to the banks and the munitions industry that were hand over fist profiting and supplying weapons to Europe, and they were begging him to pull off the cover. By 1916's re-election, he hired George Creel, Eddie Bernays, and others to begin the process of manufacturing the consent of the public, which journalists like Walter Lippmann wrote about in the 1920s on Liberty and the News, which Andy Roth and I quote in this introduction this year, because it's been 100 years since Lippmann wrote about the obligation of the elites to try to sway the public, right, according to the wishes of the educated and the elite owners and rulers of the society. And so we went back, and even though this doesn't appear until the end of the book, when we're talking about the 21st century information war that's being led by tech companies, New Knowledge, NewsGuard, all in the name of fighting fake news, all Trojan horses, we couldn't help but remember that this is exactly what Eddie Bernays not just wanted, but prescriptively called for in our culture. And if you read Renee DiResta and her information war rhetoric from New Knowledge, and she talks about how the human mind is the territory, and if you aren't a combatant, you are the territory. And once a combatant wins over a sufficient number of minds, they have the power to influence culture and society, policy and politics. According to DiResta, and this is New Knowledge, in case you don't know, they're one of 3 major firms contracted by the Senate Intelligence Committee to supply information on Russian disinformation campaigns. Only Russian disinformation campaigns. No others. None of the ones being peddled at CNN or MSNBC or Fox or the New York Times or the Washington Post, the multi-billion dollar industry of deception that we call our free press. None of those. Just Russia. DeResta goes on then to say, influencing operations exploit divisions in our society using vulnerabilities in our information ecosystem. Well, she would know because that's what she does. We have to move away from treating this as a problem of giving people better facts. That should be a red flag right there. And move towards thinking about it as an ongoing battle for the integrity of our information infrastructure. Well, guess what, Renee? If you're not interested in getting facts to the public, your infrastructure sucks. I don't know what else to say. That's a problem. You should also know that the CEO of New Knowledge is a guy by the name of Jonathan Morgan. Who knows who Jonathan Morgan is? All right. Well, let me share with you the story of Jonathan Morgan. It's a brief one. Do you remember? You'll remember this. Do you remember the special election in Alabama with Roy Moore?
Yes.
Republican Judge Roy Moore. Very controversial, contentious figure. And he was running against a typical suit, right? Corporate Democrat, Doug Jones. He edged him out. So the Democrats actually ended up winning that election. But let me tell you this. Jonathan Morgan was part of a secret project carried out on Facebook and Twitter, which was, again, arguably too small to have a significant effect on that race in Alabama. One participant, of course, in this project is Jonathan Morgan, chief executive of New Knowledge, a small cybersecurity firm, that wrote a scathing account of Russia's social media operations. An internal report on the Alabama effort obtained by the New York Times says explicitly that it, quote, experimented with many of the tactics now understood to have influenced the 2016 election. The New York Times explained. The project's operators created a Facebook page on which they posed as conservative Alabamians, using it to try to divide Republicans and even endorse a write-in candidate to draw votes from Roy Moore. It involved a scheme to link Moore to Russia that suddenly began following a lot of Russian accounts following the Republican candidate on Twitter. Quote, this is the New York Times. They orchestrated an elaborate false flag operation that planted the idea that Moore's campaign was amplified by Russia. So the New York Times understands false flag operations, but apparently only when they apply to some other relatively banal situation like Alabama. Not maybe, I don't know, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, the attempted efforts to attack Iran, the efforts to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela, or dare we say, potentially look the other way, if not outright orchestrate events like 9/11. So the New York Times is pretty savvy, I guess. Jonathan Morgan was caught interfering with the election and was suspended from Twitter for 5 days. No federal charges, no legal issues, nothing. Nothing at all. Right? So this is the person that Renee DeResta works with at New Knowledge. And we're supposed to listen to her rhetoric about this information war. So, you know who Renee DeResta reminds me of? Is none other than Eddie Bernays, who wrote in 1928, as you likely have heard this before, but it bears so much repetition because it comes right out and says, this is the culture that we will live in, this is how we will control information, and this is how we will work to pull the wires that control the public mind. We will be able to manufacture consent. We will be able to manufacture dissent. Basically be able, as a marionette does to a puppet, make the puppet jump, be scared, support various policies, even if they're against their own interests. Even if their own two eyes tell them that this is not true, they will second guess themselves because of this extraordinarily sophisticated system of propaganda. And Bernays wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Like, hold the phone, man. Did the needle scratch across the record? I know I sound like Joe Biden talking about phonographs, right? That's the only similarity we'll have tonight. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. He didn't say secret government, he didn't say deep state, but he says, these are the people that you don't see, you don't hear of, that deeply influence public agenda. And he says that's how it ought to be. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of, and indeed it was mostly men. This is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. So we see the priorities. It's not about reporting the truth or facts. It's not about fighting injustice. It's not about recognizing inequality. It's about how consumers apparently can cooperate in a manner, right, so that they can all just kind of get along. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. In other words, they may think they're working on their own innate individual agendas, unaware that they are in fact part of a much larger puzzle, where they are a necessary component of this information that maintains what Noam Chomsky called the necessary illusion of a democratic infrastructure, or the necessary illusion of an informed electorate. We get to choose between both sides. How many issues have 12 sides? Or 6 sides? And how many countries have multiple parties? Here, the same public relations firms that sell you 100 brands of shampoo and toothpaste tell you it's too hard to sell more than 2 candidates. That's by design. It is not by accident. And here's Bernays saying so, who is the godfather guru of public relations in the 20th century, that gave us everything from World War I and women's torches of freedom to smoke cigarettes, to the Banana Republic Wars in Guatemala, and he was active well into the 90s. Bernays went on to say, they, these invisible members, govern us by their qualities of natural leadership. This starts to sound like a lot of socially Darwinistic rubbish. Their natural ability of leaders, their ability to supply needed ideas, and by their key positions in the social structure, right? This gives them that tautological right. Whatever attitude one chooses toward this condition, it remains a fact that in almost every day of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. Thank you, Uncle Siggy. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness our social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. If you have not read this, I strongly encourage you to take a few hours some afternoon and really think about what he was saying.
That's Bernays?
That is Bernays. And Mark Crispin Miller wrote a great foreword to that edition from 2004, I believe. Century of Self by Adam Curtis from the BBC is a 4-part documentary on the happiness machine, channeling our good friend Aldous Huxley. Whom Neil Postman wrote about in Amusing Ourselves to Death, when he talked about the juxtaposition of Huxley and Orwell, and which of these dystopic forms that we had morphed into more. I still think that we've been a pretty interesting blend of those. But Postman, as writing about the technopoly and technological determinism, he sided more with Huxley. That while we would be wildly surveilled and all of these things, that we would willingly give up our information and our freedoms for desire.
Right.
And boy, was he right.
Yeah, that's right.
And if you haven't seen the 2002 documentary from Adam Curtis, Century of Self, I strongly recommend you check it out. I'm actually teaching a course at Cal State East Bay this semester called Persuasion in Media, which is a propaganda studies course. And they just read Bernays 2 weeks ago, and they just watched the movie. And so they've all been talking. They've all been kind of surprised by all of this information, and they're just kind of, a room full of early 20-year-olds for the most part, just saying like, why do we not know this?
The movie's called
Century of Self. And they just say like, is this real? And I'm just like, yes, I'm afraid so. It's like Baudrillard, right? It's real, but it isn't real. We know parts of it aren't real, but yet it's real, right? It's like a hyper-reality system of propaganda. But nevertheless, Bernays gives us some things to think about. But there are other people that have helped us along the way to try to sort of figure out where we are as a society, as a culture. And as an historian, I like to jump around and share the credit for some of the people that maybe got us thinking about how we got here, right? I've already talked to you a little bit about Bernays and a few others. How about, who remembers Carl Sagan? Sure. Right? How about The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark? Anybody remember that? From 1995. Well, Sagan wrote in 1995, I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all of the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when the people have lost their ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media, the 30-second sound bites now down to 10 seconds or less. This is 1995. We now have a president that governs by Twitter with 280 characters. Lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. Are we there yet?
Oh boy.
Well,
What's the next chapter?
the next chapter is actually a book about this topic. Anybody here ever heard of the field of study called agnotology? Anybody know a Stanford professor named Robert Proctor? Agnotology. Agnotology is the study of human ignorance and its impact on human civilization. Oh, it's a burgeoning field these days. Yeah, perfect. Right. The Hoover Institute, right? Yeah. Irony is not dead.
Stop laughing about that.
That's not funny. But look, the reason that I point this out is because it goes back to Lao Tzu. If you're not careful, you might end up where you're heading. And as an historian by day, and a media critic by night, and whatever times a day I'm still conscious, we should have known better. And I don't just mean we literate people in the room. The media purposely didn't showcase and discuss these things, and they purposely went to the lowest common denominator. And the politicians followed them to get the votes. And so, this is why later in the book, speaking of next chapters, the chapter on solutions is called Make America Think Again. Now that assumes that we were ever good at this, that we were ever a vivacious intellectual culture. Certainly some of our history has this to offer. There's a rich intellectual history in the United States. But it's one that's scarcely taught anymore at all in the areas where it's most needed in K-12. I teach intellectual history because I'm at a college and I'm at a university. And that's part of the culture there. I hope. Still. But in the K-12 areas, it's been pushed out by privatization, by starvation of the public sphere. And one of the reasons that Ralph Nader was so important at writing the foreword is that he has bemoaned the corporate capture and enclosure of the commons for a half century. And we are living the results of that absolutely disastrous cascade of decisions that were made before our eyes, and people were unable to see them, unable to grasp their consequences, or shrugged as they happened because it may be meant for a better short-term issue for them. And that is partly how we get here. And so it's taken this long to get here. We're not going to get out in 2020. We're not going to get out in 2024 or 2028 or any arbitrary calendar date. We're only going to get here when we work together across generations and work with the new largest voting bloc, millennials.
Yeah.
They have the most to lose. We're all going to die probably before then. Right? Many of us. Not you. Probably not you. But you know what I'm saying? Is that we have to give them the map. We have to show them how it happened.
A lot of them don't really want to hear from pissed off little white guys from Berkeley.
As a matter of fact, a lot of them don't. But I'm from a working class family in Newcastle. But they don't want to hear from me either.
Right.
And I know a lot of the people in Indivisible Petaluma and the younger wave of activists that are so entrenched in identity politics, this isn't even on their agenda to discuss. And I'm not saying that their focus on identity politics isn't extraordinarily important and it's been really overlooked among a lot of groups. But I'm saying that if you can't walk and chew gum at the same time and bring this into the bigger picture, then they're simply going to do what other generations of activists did, and that's turn people off. And turn other people off in a way. They've got 90% of things in common, but because they 10% don't talk the same way, they're not going to work with you. And that is destroying progressive activism. It's a problem.
But you have to take a chapter from these guys and find some photogenic, multilingual young women and write their speeches and make them do it over and over until they can do it like Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think these people are already writing their own speeches, and I think they're already doing that. And when I saw the Progressive Festival this year in Petaluma, while I was sad to not see some of the things that I'd seen there for years, and I also know that there wasn't a great handoff where everybody was communicative about keeping some of the momentum and some of the continuity involved, I saw an extraordinarily diverse group of people standing up and talking about injustice and inequality that really care about what's happening, and they care about it every day of the year. And that's heartening, right? And so I can shut up for 5 minutes because I am a white guy with a platform, right? And I am privileged in this culture, right? And so I can take it. I can take them talking to me and telling me to shut up, right?
Pradita nailed it.
Could I have a turn?
Yeah, in a minute, yeah, but we're not even at that part of the discussion yet, but we're sort of improvising. But please, yes.
I have my hand up.
Yes, it's true, so please go ahead. Please.
I went to the climate strike the other day.
Yes.
A lot of the young people, I saw so many great young people.
Absolutely.
I think we all need to be careful.
Yeah.
Of that we've got everything to teach somebody else. Man, they are on it.
Yeah.
They're not sitting around talking. They are
It's
fucking
symbiotic.
on it.
It's symbiotic,
all around the
right?
world. There's a lot for us to learn from
There
them. I've
is.
been an activist longer than some of the people here have been alive. I mean,
Yeah.
really long fucking time.
Yeah,
Okay?
and
Excuse my language.
my daughter is not yet 13 and is radically critical of things that my wife and I do. Because we're from another generation, right? And we have to hear about how, we have to be careful about the intersectional identification of inanimate objects, right? I mean, because it's going into the direction of just like, hey man, watch out how you're talking, right? Yeah. And even though you may not, imply or mean or intend X, It's all part of this broader structure of oppression that we've been living in for a long time.
Called bullying.
Yeah, it is. It's called a lot of things.
Bullying.
But, so, by my not doing this with these groups of people, I'm just waiting for the pause and the action when I can say, has anybody in here read Hannah Arendt? And most of the hands are down. Has anybody in that group read The Origins of Totalitarianism? Because this isn't the first time that this has happened. So, as someone that's older, I'm supposed to be more patient. I'm supposed to allow impetuous indiscretions among other activated groups who are very, very worried about a future that they can't see. So if I wait, and I sit, and I come back to them, and I hear and take some of the brunt of their anger, I might get 5 minutes in. Or I say, did you think about this? Or did you know this? Or have you seen these things? And just say, just check them out. Just check them out. Maybe there'll be things that you find to be useful. And let me know how I can help you do the things you're doing.
Yeah, I would say being present,
Yeah.
really listening rather than thinking, and then I'm going to tell them whatever, blah, 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 blah. And coming from our hearts. I mean, these were not stupid people.
No, and they can smell that.
I mean, how many of us have been to the last city council meeting? Right on, but more of those kids have than are sitting in this room.
They can smell entitlement from a mile away.
Yeah,
right?
that too.
And so, it's important to remember that times change. It's hard sometimes for us to see them change when we're in them. And we do what we do based on what we've known. And change is hard even for people that propose change. Right? And so I think that we are at a critical juncture where we have an opportunity to teach, to learn, to listen, to follow, to lead, and do all of that mighty dance that we can do. And we have previous generations, warts and all, that did that. And we can learn from mistakes, and we can try to think anew ideas that just don't normally pop up in my 50-year-old brain. Right? But if I listen long enough, they'll come up with an angle on something that I can glom onto and say, gee, you know what? That just reminded me of 10 other things. Maybe I'm not even telling them the right things, right? But I wouldn't know that if I'm not listening, or if I'm not showing up and being present. And of course, we all are busy. We all can't be omnipresent. But I think it's important that we don't fall back into the trap of the left-wing circular firing squad.
Yeah.
And it does tend to fall on generational lines. It falls on other lines, but it falls on generational lines. And as someone that's my age, I tend to work with people in their 70s and 80s, but then I have the privilege of hanging out with teenagers and 20-year-olds, right? And I'm sort of bridging the gaps between all those people and people that are my age, trying to say, well, we don't want to recreate those wheels, and we don't want to try things that don't work, but 20-year-olds need to know who Ralph Nader is. But Ralph Nader also needs to know who the 20-year-olds are.
Building community.
And it comes around.
The technology has. So the reason I've arrived tonight is I'm going to go visit my daughter who happens to be on the right.
Yeah.
And I've spent the last few years being with, listening, hearing what she's thinking and trying to hear it and not give my opinions because you know what? It's true.
It's your mom.
And I know that. But I still visit and I still adore the grandchildren. I adore her. But the question I hold, and she's part of a whole, she's in Colorado and that's who they are. A big piece of them.
Yeah.
And I'd love to say something that would move a mountain, but heretofore I've remained very involved, engaged, but not opinionated. And that's been helpful. But there is a point where I feel that there has to be a few things that I say. And I really don't know what the most pregnant, the most prominent things would be that would help her to begin to look in a different formula. And I don't know how I turned out this way, my sister had 8 Fox News TVs in her house. And I got very sick there.
Yeah,
I couldn't fly home. And it's just that we don't get how hard it is to, we do get, but how difficult it is to really counter this opinionated world.
Keeping the bridge open, and I spoke with my daughter. Our daughters were in the same class, right? If I'm remembering where I know you from. And what I said to her today is, honey, you might not really get it, and actually I'm older than you are, Nikki, but anyway, you might not really get it. I'm probably going to last maybe another 10 years, maybe not. But you're probably going to last more than 10 years, and your kids are. And things are going to be really heating up. You think the fires are bad now? And I could see her face change. It's important to keep the bridge open.
And that's also why the last chapter of this book is about solutions to the challenges we face that would work for everybody.
So let's talk about
So
that.
yeah, let's talk about some of that. I mentioned a rent a moment ago, and the reason I mentioned that is because we've already been here. We've already been in these kind of cultural conundrums of fascism. And it's important to go back and remember the way in which some of these people eloquently described it. Because the noise and the din of the contemporary media culture, you don't get any kind of historically moored intellectual critiques about any of this. You just get more noise. And so they're reacting to that. They're reacting to being bombarded, right? Because they also are products of an educational system that stopped teaching people critical thinking and debate years ago and began justifying people's confirmation bias that whatever they think feels right is okay.
And who succeeded?
Well,
Who made it to the
they've
top?
succeeded.
Yeah.
Arendt wrote this: in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. This is the era of fake news. Except she's writing this in 1951. Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that, under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day, and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie, and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness, weapons of mass destruction.
What was the name of it?
Russiagate. These are examples going on right before our eyes that Arendt warned us about in 1951 in a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. So again, we know this stuff. And it's not just the people in the room that know it. We as a society have had the opportunity to teach and learn and talk about this stuff for generations. This is what we can teach some of those young people at the Climate Justice March after we go there to support them, and after we go there to help them do what they need to do, and after they start to trust that we're not just another group of people that's trying to tell them what to do.
And how well did we trust the old people when we were young?
Well, of course.
Remember that.
But that is why that we got to, in this book, we have the chapters, of course, that go through. And by the way, this book is dedicated to our students, past and present, with an eye to the future. The book is dedicated to people that want to learn. And part of learning is disagreeing. and having constructive arguments and criticism, right? But again, we've lost the art of doing those things, even with each other who agree about 90% of things. And so what example are we? I know the example that Fox News and MSNBC are setting. It's like a 3-ring circus with people throwing chairs at each other. That's why when I have students come into my class and I talk about the art of constructing arguments, they're like, I don't like arguments. I don't want to fight. And I'm just like, arguments are not fights, right? An argument, when we're talking about critical thinking, constructing an argument, that's a construction zone, not a combat zone. And but you've got to really unteach that in them because they don't trust that you're going to help them. They think you're going to talk at them. And they think you're not going to listen.
Politics is the thing. I mean, older people too are afraid to talk about politics to each other.
Many of them are. The first chapter is How Do We Get Here? The second one is The Crumbling Fourth Estate. After that is Breaking News is Broken News. The third is The Truth is the Greatest Enemy of the State. The fourth is We Distort, You Abide. And each of these chapters is replete with both historic and current examples of how we got here. And the last, Make America Think Again. We, in the beginning of this book, specifically highlight how our privatized democracy and the corporate enclosure of our commons, going back to James Buchanan, Milton Friedman, Charles and David Koch, Nixon, Agnew, Grover Norquist, the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute. This has all happened by design. Lewis Powell memo, 1971, just before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. We go at length about Powell in here. The forgotten memo that was the blueprint for the right-wing takeover of the public sphere. They did it.
The plan for the New American Century.
The project for the New American Century is the next generational iteration of it, and they're doing that.
Right.
They're doing it.
They did it, 9/11.
They're doing it. They're in 7 countries. They're doing it. And they even admitted, by the way, in the Rebuilding America's Defenses document published in 2000, the Project for the New American Century, they used to have an office on the same floor at the American Enterprise Institute, right? And these are the same people as the Weekly Standard and the neocons that were the architects of the so-called War on Terror. These are the same people that wrote that they had this big plan of full-spectrum dominance. They were going to take over the Middle East and the oil. They were going to re-encircle Russia and China. They're doing all of it. They said they were going to do it, but they said this: absent some catalyzing and catalytic event, like a new Pearl Harbor, we will likely not be able to institute such a massive agenda. And a year later, guess what? They got their event and they immediately called it a new Pearl Harbor. And off to the races they went. The Bush administration already had designs to invade Iraq in January of 2001. There was nothing that 9/11 did for them other than provide necessary cover for the next generation.
Well, they took the Patriot Act right off the shelf.
Yeah, it was already written. So what we write about in the beginning, however, is something that we call the 4 major public vulnerabilities. And so the rest of the book is predicated on this idea that we have some parts of our culture that have been wantonly exploited by the private, corporate, for-profit class. And just in a nutshell, I want to just tell you, rattle off what we said that these were, and then I want to get to the solutions chapter and hear what you think about that. We have a pervasive commercial entertainment culture. Well, that's been coming forever. And, there were Daniel Boorstin, the great historian from the 60s, warned us about TV culture in 1962 in a book called The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America. It was the primer on fake news of its day. And if you don't remember Boorstin or don't know about this book is one of the more important historical books of that time that gives us a crucial understanding of how we got here now, right? And there's just a couple of choice quotes in that book that he could have written them yesterday had he still been alive. He says, "Never have people been more masters of their environment, yet never has a people felt more deceived and disappointed. For never has a people expected so much more than the world could offer. We are ruled by extravagant expectations. By harboring, nourishing, and ever enlarging our extravagant expectations, we create the demand for the illusions with which we deceive ourselves and which we pay others to make to deceive us. We have become so accustomed to our illusions that we mistake them for reality. This is 1962. We demand them, and we demand that there always be more of them, bigger and better and more vivid. They are the world of our making, the world of the image. And guess how we've gotten the image beamed at us in these vulnerable ways? Well, here we go. Let's go down the list. I'll find the list. I know it's here. We have a pervasive commercial entertainment culture, number one. Number two, we now exist in a culture of extreme and hyper-partisanship. Check. And then we talk about how we got there. We have an utterly fragmented media landscape in an utterly media-saturated environment. We can't even avoid it. We can scarcely even turn it off. It's so loud and ubiquitous. Because we'll hear it from someone, some way, somewhere.
What about the cat people in the porno?
And the last is we have succeeded at creating an ineffective educational system. And in fact, one of the things that Trump's campaign said is that we won with the poorly educated. They celebrated that milestone.
And Rockefeller helped out.
That's right, absolutely. They had a lot of help going back a long ways. So did Bill Gates help out. So did Diane Ravitch help out when she was architect of No Child Left Behind. Though, to her almighty credit, she has been the most outspoken critic of her own policies, has apologized and admitted how wrong she was, and has dedicated the rest of her career to trying to fix it. Diane Ravitch.
What's she done?
She has been on the forefront of the anti-corporatization and privatization of the public education system. She is totally, she's the one that helped start the testing system, and she's trying to end it.
Yeah, Google her, you'll get a lot.
Oh yeah. The Death and Life of the Great American School System is one of the books.
Give me her name again?
Diane Ravitch. Ravitch. Oh, you'll find her. Yeah. She pissed off everybody on the right in the corporate sector because they were singing her praises for years. And then she showed up at one of the conferences one year, and she had a big keynote, and they were all like, oh man, things are going great. And she was like, I was wrong. And they were just like, what? Everything I said was predicated on false assumptions, and we are now destroying education. And she's trying to fix it. But man, it's real hard to fix something after you broke it good. Because it broke, common, it's broken.
Yep.
And the teachers can't fix it on their own. And the students, we can't expect them to fix it on their own. Right? They're telling us what it does and doesn't work, but they need our help. Teachers need our help. School boards need our help. They can't do it alone.
And they're getting attention because they're walking out of school, which means the schools are losing money. And in a capitalist society like this, that makes a big difference.
Well, look, if you starve the schools enough that makes a difference, then they get to red herring it and straw person it all day long. They'll never admit that this was by design, going back to Friedman, going back to Buchanan, going back specifically to Agnew, and definitely Grover Norquist, who infamously said that he wanted to shrink government down to a size that it could be drowned in a bathtub. And are we there yet? So this is the problem. We have government largesse when it comes to the national security complex, military-industrial complex, and support for big ag and big pharma, and for the corporate state. We have nothing that is technically on more than life support system that works in the public interest. And the most successful programs remaining out of the New Deal and the Great Society, from Social Security to Medicare, are on the chopping block now, even with the great Kamala Harris, right? And if you criticize her, I guess it's a double whammy. You're sexist and racist. This is how identity politics has backfired extraordinarily, right? And this is why we need to focus on policy and who's funding these campaigns, and not just what they look like on TV.
I'm not allowed to criticize the new director of the Independent Office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach.
Because
She's a Latina.
Yes,
And
but-
it doesn't matter what she does.
But that's how the
I'm
right
not
has
allowed to
co-opted
criticize.
left language. That's how political correctness got off-leashed and is being weaponized against the very people that were trying to protect others. This is the same way that Trump weaponized fake news, right? Your fake news. Anything he disagrees with, your fake news, right? This is how the propaganda works. What do we do about that? Well, here you go. Henry Giroux said, in the end, there is no democracy without informed citizens. And we start in the conclusion by saying, post-truth is pre-fascism. This is what Timothy Snyder wrote in the book on tyranny. Whether or not people of the country allow authoritarianism, disinformation, and corporate control to be further normalized depends on what we, the people, do to strengthen ourselves, our public interest networks, and our democracy. Reclaiming civic sovereignty from corporate influence will require the transformation of key institutions, particularly schools and the free press, to change with technology in order to ensure that they serve the public rather than exploit it. What can be done? 5 C's. Civics education, critical thinking, critical awareness of media, community engagement, and cultural competency, which also includes teaching empathy. Critical media literacy education and the 5 C's, right? We go through and we talk about how this is not new. There are critical pedagogy scholars of the 20th century that have long talked about this. And we go in detail about every one of the C's. We have pages on civics education, pages on critical thinking pedagogy. We have pages on critical awareness of media and community engagement and cultural competency. We also then talk about transformations of the way we stay informed in a digital age, starting by broadening news media framing. Look, people in this room know this, but you all know 10 people in your lives that don't, or they forgot. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, NPR is but a sliver of the visible spectrum of the universe. Independent journalists have long been talking about the full spectrum of ideas with facts, and they exist. In 1928, Aldous Huxley wrote in a famous piece called On Proper Studies, "Facts don't cease to exist simply because they're ignored." We're saying that we need to support a media ecosystem that does this. It not only teaches people how to be the media and encourages critical media consumption, it shows people what it looks like.
Here, here.
And it gives people 100 places to find it, right? We give this to people, not only in our books, we give this stuff away for free on our website. I mean, these sources, this pedagogy, this information, we give it away to anybody who asks. I have the PDFs of my books for free to all of my students so they don't have to buy them because they don't know where their next meal's coming from, some of them. You know, and this is at university, not just a community college. And it's at Sonoma State too. Don't kid yourself that it's the whitest, richest school in the state system. It is. It is. But there's people struggling there. And it's mostly marginalized communities. And we can fix that. But you have to address it in order to fix it. And we do that at Social Justice Week every spring. And this spring, Angela Davis and Noam Chomsky are coming. So, thanks to Peter Phillips for helping make those things happen.
Coming when?
In March. So stay tuned to the Project Censored site and we'll make those announcements. We need to broaden news framing. Some of you may remember William Arkin, who famously resigned from NBC last year. He wrote an amazing screed about why he quit the corporate media. He couldn't believe the fact that the people that he had worked with for 30 years had become so completely indoctrinated. Right? And he's like, I just can't be part of this anymore. So we quote at length his own words about what it was like to work at NBC the last several years since Trump was electored. Right? I mean, it's an eye-opening, sobering communique that we ignore at our own peril. These are more canaries in the coal mine telling us what we need to do. And they're offering their expertise if we only listen.
They're whistleblowers.
They are absolutely whistleblowers, and guess what? We need more local and investigative journalism. And by the way, other countries do this better than we do. And even though these following organizations are elitist and have many problems of their own, they are contributing to reinvigorating local investigative journalism in this country, and they include the Poynter Institute, the Knight Foundation, and the Nieman people at Harvard, right? And yes, they have warts. But I also know some of the people that work at these places that do absolutely amazing public intellectual work that's selfless. Whether it's Yasha Levine or Victor Pickard, these people are on the front lines of trying to reboot how everything from the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine to the Telecom Act of 1996 further imploded by controlled demolition our media system. And they did it on purpose. Starved journalists to go after only the low-hanging fruit and forget about the muckraking stories that we needed most. They did it on purpose. There's also the need for more educational news media. You're taping this. People do talks. My students do presentations in class. In a 20-minute conversation that my students have, I could record it, I could put it up on CNN, and 3 million people would learn something that CNN had likely never talked about in their entire existence.
But they wouldn't play it.
They wouldn't play it. But my point is it's not because they can't do it intellectually, it's because they won't do it ideologically. And that is what has to change, or else they cannot lay claim to not only being the most trusted name in news, but they can't lay claim that they have the great stewardship of the public airwaves because they've hijacked and stolen them for profit and deception. And that's a matter of fact. That is not a hyperbolic statement. It is something that we prove in our books year after year, and we're talking about people that are trying to change it. And it's a slow process. Free Press in New Jersey got a hold of a couple of moribund radio frequencies and sold them off, and they raised $5 million to kickstart local journalistic efforts in that state. And it's happening. It's not happening overnight. It's not going to fix... Lincoln Steffens didn't wrote Shame of the City in 15 minutes. He wrote it over a course of years of investigating it and calling out the great corruption, the unholy alliance, as he called it, between corrupt business people and politicians, right? This is the kind of reporting that still goes on. It's just not on TV. It's being paraded around now with Ukraine that suddenly we should worry that, well, did Donald Trump somehow push the Ukrainian government to investigate Joe Biden and his son on the big gas company in Ukraine? And I'm just scratching my eyes and saying, like, why wasn't this a problem when Victoria Nuland told the EU representatives to go fuck himself? That was a quote from a phone call. Because they weren't waiting to move on Ukraine. They spent $5 billion there, and they were going to do what they wanted. And that included putting Joe's kid on the top of the board at one of the big natural gas companies there. Why wasn't that corrupt then?
This should bring both of them.
It should bring them crashing down all the system, right? This is how venally, bipartisanly corrupt that this is. But it's amazing that they can actually report part of that story without ever missing how much they blew it in 2014. Right? I mean, this is how deep the deception goes.
It's worse than that.
It is arguably worse than that. We end on a note with the information war, and we talk about not only broadening news frames and reinvigorating local journalism, giving several examples, we also talk about the absolute necessity of protecting whistleblowers.
Yeah.
Chelsea Manning rots in prison as we sit here.
Yeah.
Julian Assange rots in prison as we sit here. And the judge in Britain has said that they do not plan on releasing Assange. He's being held in conditions worse than people who were accused terror suspects. And he is being denied legal counsel to prepare his defense against extradition to the United States, where his life will be destroyed. Even further than now. And the shot across the bow has been seen by all. This attack on the free press has been duly noted by all those who are silent in the corporate media in the U.S., who cheered on these kinds of punishments for Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and Reality Winner and John Kiriakou and Thomas Drake. We could go on and on with how many of these people, how much we know, because these people risked their careers and their lives, many of them now ruined, as a result of telling us what's going on. And so we end the book by saying our work The work is cut out for us, but we have blueprints, we have maps, we have allies. We have people that we may only agree 10, 15, or 20%, but we need to then work with them. There's a lot of people on the right that think that corporate media is bullshit.
That's right.
And you know what? They're right.
Yeah.
They may not always be right for the same reasons, but they do get the structural chicanery that befuddles their existence, and they don't trust it for a reason.
That's right.
A lot of reasons. And the more that we find common ground with the conservative family member, the more we find common ground with the other person on the left that thinks they're woker and doper than me, and the more we sit down and try to get to what's at the bottom of all of this, is that we want a better, more vibrant, inclusive, and tolerant future for all of us with a better, healthier planet. You know, again, find the people that are going to oppose that, and you'll know who the enemy is.
Yeah.
But you find the people that find their common ground on wanting good food, and they want good camaraderie, and they want a nice place to be, and they want to have community. You have something in common with them, whether you think abortion is right or not.
That's right.
And this is, again, why everything from identity politics to single issues really have helped bifurcate and divide us. And you know, the global 1%, the giants, division is the blood that runs in their veins.
The key.
It's the key to how they maintain control of the kingdom.
Divided we fall.
That's why we have to not be distracted, right?
Well-
Media manipulation is a big, big part of this, and FCC Chairman Nick Johnson warned us of this years ago in a book called Second Priority. He said, whatever your first area of interest is, so go ahead and fill in your Palestine, the social justice, electoral reform, prison reform, eradication of poverty, the
Making
environment.
each month rent.
Magnetic frequency.
If your second priority isn't media democracy and media reform, you're likely to gain little ground or traction in your primary areas of interest.
That's right.
Media democracy, transparency, and fighting against censorship is a common battle for everybody, right to left, up to down, right to wrong, across the color spectrum, from Mars or anywhere else.
Yes.
And if we can't simply wrap our heads around those concepts and principles, we will be spinning our wheels. How about worse? We will be fiddling while far more than Rome burns. Last point, because it goes all the way back to Carl Jensen. And I owe a lot to Carl. He's no longer with us, right? But Carl started something. And when he started Project Censored, he had Hugh Downs from 2020 on board, and I.F. Stone, and Walter Cronkite. Like luminary media people. And he actually had Michael Crichton and even some other libertarian people that got the cross the aisles business. And Carl in 1995, when he was stepping away from the project, wrote this, which I think is just as timely as it ever was, and it gives us, I think, something collectively that we can all help try to bring about. He said, since we'll all benefit from a more responsible media, we really should help bring it about. To do this, the corporate media owners should start to earn their unique First Amendment privileges. Editors should rethink their news judgment. Journalists should persevere in going after the hard stories. Journalism professors should emphasize ethics. I've got the Society of Professional Journalists 4 points of ethics up here that I teach in my classes. Seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, be accountable and transparent. Will somebody quickly send this to Fox and CNN and the New York Times and everywhere else? Right? Tell them that this is where we need to be operating.
How do you minimize harm and tell the truth?
Well, Jensen goes on to say an important element. The journalism professors should emphasize ethics and critical analysis and turn out more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers. The judicial system should defend the freedom of the press, provision of the First Amendment with far more vigor, and the public should show the media it's more concerned with the high crimes and misdemeanors of its political and corporate leaders than it is with the crimes and gossip of celebrities that now apparently seem to occupy some of the same Venn diagram. Jensen ends by saying the effort will be well worth it. And I cannot disagree with him. To this day, the effort is still worth it, and I wonder how much time we may have left, but I think with the time we have, this is part of the struggle that we should probably try to work on together, however we can. And that means asking of me the things that we do and we have, you telling us what you're doing, and we have people on the radio or we sponsor events together, we share email lists. It means we actually work together when and where we can. And so this is an open invitation to everyone here that I am willing to make the effort to make that happen. So if I can help or if I can be of any kind of support, I have cards over there, I've got books for sale here, and I live in Petaluma. So you know where to find me. Yay!
Louder, please.
Yeah, I have a question. My question is, we understand that the media is owned corporately to deceive and construct realities that are illusions. But we also have other things working against our ability to think critically, and that certainly would be all the neurotoxins that we're being presented with as a society in the air, the water, and the food, and the fluorides in many of the water supplies. But more importantly, what is escalating right now would be the electromagnetic frequencies for mind control. And we know that that does usurp our neurological abilities to function and think. And this is now engulfing the world and coming in, as we all have been hearing, as 5G. But it's the smart meters that you and I spoke with about many years ago. And now the smart water meters. We have such a maze of frequencies in our cities, we're not able to think. So how does that work in to what you talk about?
It would work in this way, that we need to have regulatory agencies that are not captured by the industries they supposedly regulate. That's step one.
But they are.
Of course, but that's step one. You've got to have a massive campaign around ending that fox hen house practice. It needs to be called out at every turn, and science needs to be reclaimed as an actual practice, not something bought and paid for by corporations. This is another example of the corporate enclosure of the commons, that of human knowledge and the scientific method itself. You know, from topics from cell phone radiation to vaccines, we are not given accurate information about their full efficacy, and we are never taught about the potential downsides to some of these rollouts in some vulnerable parts of the population. There's an entire VAERS court that was created in 1986 to shield Big Pharma from any problems with vaccines. The FCC has helped shield tech companies from cell phones, other radiations. This is again why I answered the question the best way I knew how. Until you reclaim the idea that science is just whatever Bayer says it is or Monsanto says it is, right? And that it is an actual process not sullied by the conflicts of interest and money and profit. For example, one of the editors of The Lancet, one of the most widely respected medical journals in the world, wrote several years ago, about 3 years ago, wrote a piece that was the #1 story in our Censored 2017 book that lives right down here, that upwards of half of the articles in scientific and medical journals was flawed or false. And if not, falsified because of its sponsors and because of where it was coming from and how tainted the university institutions have become with corporate donors and money. Right? That's an issue. Until you go and address that, it's not going to change. Because they're telling you what the bought and paid for science is. They're not actually going to go out and actually do it. They're just not.
Well,
I'd like to add something here. I don't know if you're aware of the Smith-Mundt.
Yeah, that's gone. That's gone. Smith-Mundt Act?
The Modernization Act of 2012.
Yeah. So that led to the Global Engagement Center and the NDAAs. So in other words, that totally made legal foreign propaganda, even if it comes back for domestic purposes.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're saying it's
No.
gone?
So that's,
The that's there. The protection against it is gone.
So to
exactly
explain
my
the-
point.
Yeah.
So that the government and the media are legally able to lie to us.
Absolutely.
And they do.
So
Yeah.
prior to that, they had to do it illegally, basically.
And they did. And
Right, it hasn't changed, but they legalized it.
yeah, they legalized it.
In 2012, so, I mean,
One of the chapters in the 2017 book by Brian Covert is a history of CIA media manipulation. And it matter-of-factly traces it back to Frank Weisner, calling it the Mighty Wurlitzer. That was smaller program, was later Operation Mockingbird. And it infiltrated most major newsrooms in the United States, and they had scripted top-down messaging to keep certain narratives afloat and kill certain others. Right out of the same period of the 1950s was also MK Ultra. And it was not wildly successful. And believe it or not, this is actually amazing. Stephen Kinzer, who's a rather liberal establishment historian and journalist, has a new book on the history of MK Ultra and one of the chief doctors there. And the book is called Poisoner in Chief. And this book is actually getting reviewed by the New York Times. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. I can't believe it. I'm not sure how it's happening. What's that?
What are they saying?
Well, they're not crapping on it. So
That's
that's amazing. And I think part of it is because Kinzer is such an establishment figure. He was a journalist at the Times for decades. He's written Overthrow. He wrote the history about the rise of the Shah in Iran. I mean, so, while I won't say Kinzer's been, totally perfect, and he's certainly more liberal than radical, but Kinzer has exposed some great deceptions of the 20th century in a way that other historians and journalists have been unsuccessful. And I don't know how he's done it, but I'm going to have him on the show next month, and I'm going to ask him.
So he just brought up something, the
Smith-Mundt Act
Okay,
from World War
so do
II.
you talk about that in your distraction? Because that would be legalizing.
Yeah, it is. It may be footnoted in there, but there's 100 other things in there that do the same thing.
But it's legalized disinformation.
Yeah, we've written about it in here. It was in 2 or 3 different versions of this book when it was happening.
So, in a sentence, how would you define what that allows?
It makes legal any form of deception or propaganda, even if intended for foreign audiences.
And who authorized that?
That was passed under the Obama administration.
And by who? What legislative branch?
It was an
HR or something?
No, it was part of the bill, and it's also a part of the National Defense Authorization Act, where they created a global engagement center for $160 million to generate the propaganda that they just legally gave them the right to disseminate. That was all under Obama, and Congress voted for it.
That brutalized America and just further.
In one of so many ways.
Yes.
But I mean, the real problem is that when you have people crowing about fake news, it's like, well, let's censor 2020 vision through the looking glass. Well, Alice is all through here, down the rabbit hole, right? And we riff on that in much of the book. But some people are not fully aware of the degree to which the fake news conundrum was created to generate bogus solutions for the problems that weren't the problem.
Yeah.
So there's a whole chapter in here on the Trojan horse of fighting fake news that talks about the big tech determinists that are saying that algorithms and spiking content and deplatforming people and censoring people is big tech solving the problem of fake news. And since most people blame big tech for fake news in the 2016 election, they're cheering it on. People who propose to be media illiteracy educators are begging for Google money for NewsGuard so that they can rate websites and have people just look at the websites in a way that's slightly, arguably not more sophisticated than even what Snopes has done, right? And Snopes has got lots of problems and biases. So the idea is that you can't outsource critical thinking. You have to do it yourself. Otherwise, someone will gladly do it for you. And they'll, in fact, even package it up neatly by pretending to fight deception. And this is where we are down that rabbit hole. This is where we are. In the back, you had a comment.
I just want to know, I'm out there chasing the sheriffs who are sweeping homeless people off of public property. Is this just a distraction, or how does this fit in?
I don't know that I allege that was a distraction or imply it.
No, you didn't. She's only asking.
You're just asking? What is the distraction? The fact that someone is trying to do something about it, or the police are taking people off public property?
I'm spending a lot of my time trying to save them from going to jail.
What's wrong with that? That's an incredible humanitarian effort.
I know. But I'm being distracted from the real housing issue.
Are you?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not a banker, you're not a mortgage person.
True.
You're not someone in a position to gift homes to people. So what can you do as a citizen that's concerned about the struggle of homelessness as a civil right
I've
issue?
done this for 4 years. I mean, it's time that maybe the Press Democrat covered.
Well, they're not going to cover it. Why would Darius Anderson cover that?
Right, he's part of.
I mean, he's part of the problem.
Yes.
Call the Bohemian.
Yeah,
Call Stet. Call Will Carruthers. Call Peter Byrne.
Peter Byrne, right.
yeah.
Those are people that will write about this stuff.
Make Ilero reports.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. That's not a distraction at all.
Okay.
If more people weren't distracted by watching football on Sundays or doing whatever their guilty pleasures are, and they spent 2 hours a week giving back to community, imagine what it might look like if you weren't one of 3 people out there doing X. Or God knows how many things you've done over the years, Susan. Right? And all of you. I mean, I don't know all of you personally, but some of the ones that I do know, I know what you've done. And I know how thankless it is, right?
Bohemian is going to
Bring
this week a correction of a mistake. that
This
they
is
got-
good, and that's what
something
they
I
should
said.
do.
They're not going to correct.
No,
Well,
they're correct.
look, the Bohemian this week, she says, is fixing an error.
They're going to destroy the culture. And there's going to be the bottom low that falls through the cracks.
Well, that's already
They're
happened.
living in a creek.
That's already happened. I mean, that we're watching it happen.
It's gonna happen more.
And by the way, when I say we're watching it happen, I mean those of us who are aware that it's happening can see that it's happening. There's a whole part of our culture that not only doesn't see it, they don't want to see it.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the tech bro culture of Market Street literally has people camping out on the sidewalk to protest homeless people's existence.
Yeah.
And I say, how about a solution? Donate half your bloated salary to creating homes for the homeless and you won't have to walk past them on your privileged way to work.
There you go.
Right?
There you go.
Well, look, those are solutions that could happen. These are things that can happen if we try to educate people and if we push like Peter does in Giants. He writes a direct letter to people and says, you know who you are. You know how much wealth and power and prestige you have. Why don't you shave off 0.0001% of it and stop starvation globally? Because you could.
That's not the plan.
It's not the plan because the plan is desperation. And the plan is to kill people off.
That's right, genocide.
But they're doing it passively because they don't have to see it. Right?
That's
And
right.
part of why Peter wrote that book
They're
is
done.
because he wants not only more people to see it, he wants them
Kids.
to see it. He wants them to admit that they are aware that they are part of the problem killing the planet.
Take responsibility for it.
It's their planet too. I mean, at what point do they not have a stake?
Transhumanism.
Well, that's nonsense. What people going to Mars and Elon Musk, that's just escapist rubbish. These people know that the best bet they have is right here. They just don't know how to implement it and still maintain cultural authority. And that's the challenge.
I just wonder if you have heard of the movie called Human Resources?
Oh, that's good.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
I would recommend it to you for your
Yeah,
brilliant
great.
mind, and it augments so much.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'll definitely look it up.
Where is it available?
Human Resources, I've watched it through Amazon.
No, that's bad, but good to watch. But in other words, the wrong Amazon is burning, right? We know this. I appreciate when people share resources with me like that because I'll go and I bring it into the classroom and I try to show students some of the newer, latest stuff. And there's Chris Oscar sitting there who made the Project Censored movie, ending the reign of junk food news, right? Who donated 6 years of his life and a whole pile of money with Doug Hecker to make that movie and get it into hundreds of classrooms around the country, and we're still showing it, right? And we're just now finishing the next installment of that film because we would need to show, because it's, well, more sophisticated, the deception is more sophisticated, right? And so we anything we can do, younger people definitely in this country are, screens are a problem, right? But one way that you can get to some of these folks is through the screen. And if you can get them to watch a 10, 20, 30-minute clip or some kind of a video, and then you hand over the other things behind it, and then they start doing it themselves, and you tell them as an assignment, hey, instead of writing a paper, why don't you get in a group, and you go and grab the phone camera, and you grab the microphone, and you write down some script stuff, and why don't you go out and interview some people? Why don't you make your own media counter story to the things that are happening in your own community? That is remarkably empowering as a pedagogy for people.
Well, they're in an augmented reality through the screens.
Yeah, but they can also communicate, but they can also, demonizing the screens is a sure way to shut them off and turn them down.
And they need to say,
I'm aware of this, but they're not going to listen to you when you tell them that. Let them go and find out how to use that technology to learn about the very things that you're warning them about, and then they may voluntarily start to put them down, right?
Well, we're not asking to put them down.
Well,
Use them more intelligently.
we ask the same, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the same sources, from everything from ZAP to Screen Free Week, and so on. Anything we can do to get people, young people especially, realizing that these devices come with them great costs, including surveillance, privacy, health.
Kind of a weapon.
It's a weapon. But again, trying to get them to use those things to their advantage is a tool that empowers them. They don't feel like they're taking a test, right? You basically help them understand that we don't need to take tests in class because you're taking one out there every day when you get here, right? You're taking tests with the gas station. You're taking tests with the fossil fuel culture. You're taking tests with the GMOs. You're taking tests with pesticides. You're taking tests with vaping. Everything you're doing is a test. Are you studying for the test? Because if you're not studying for what you're using and putting into your body and into the environment, you're failing the test.
That's right.
No A that I can give you in this classroom because you read some smart book is going to change that. And so I've had to retool the entire way that I learned and taught because the whole culture has shifted out from under me.
Yeah.
It's not the same. I'm one of those people that has this, a phone, a pad, but then I also have this. You saw my talk. I'm still doing this. I'm stuck between generations. Right? I'm like the Twilight Zone episode.
And you write in cursive.
And I don't write in cursive anymore. I quit that. Yeah, it's a lost art and I'm ashamed of it. But I have taught my kids.
Now students can read what you write on the board.
It's hard to read, right?
Yeah, but see, you don't write on the board anymore. You just show them the stuff, right? Yeah, back in the day, 20 years ago, I was doomed because my handwriting's terrible. People are like, I can't read that. You know, they must not be important too. So, but yeah, we all do what we can. But you know, ultimately, again, not preaching towards people, but rather meeting them where they are in a way that asks them, like, because they say, well, what can I do about this? I just look at them and I say, I don't know. What do you think you can do? Like, what can you do? Tell me what your skills are. What are your interests? And then I'll start throwing whatever resources I have. And then we'll come back and talk about it again, right? I mean, that's kind of a way that we learn from each other. Because if I go to them and pretend I have all the answers, they're not going to listen to a word I say.
Amen.
They won't listen to half a lick of it.
Amen.
I have to earn their trust. I realize that. But I do. That's my main goal. And once I get partway there, you know, then I start unloading more and we work through it together. And for a lot of these people, it's the first time they've maybe ever heard of some of these things that are in some of these books. And you know what? Some of them are kind of freaked out. Some of them are kind of freaked out. So you don't want to shut people down and you know.
They
blow
might
the whole
freak
shit.
out. They just might.
They're gonna. Yeah.
I'm just telling you, don't like to wrap up.
Yeah, we're good. I'd like to thank everybody for being here and being patient and tolerant in the heat. Also with some of my ranting. We have books available and I'm happy to sell them at discounts to anybody that wants them if you want to donate. The censored book isn't even out until early October, but I have copies of it here. Forced Distraction is available. If you happen to be a teacher, educator on any level, and you'd like to review this material for use in your classes, please take a card over there or ask me for a card and send me an email so I can send you a free PDF version of the book so you can look at it and see if it's something that you think you can use. If you are also somebody in education or know those people in education, the Project Censored Radio Show archives go back 9 years, and there's a lot of great shows there that have conversations with people that are really working to try to make a difference in the world, and they can be pretty inspiring for people of any walk of life. So, thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks for all the things.